Get off my property, I shouted as the HOA president smirked while her workers loaded my prized Holstein cattle onto their trucks. Your property? She sneered, waving legal documents in my face. Not for long, Frank Miller. I've waited 20 years for this day. The rage in her eyes was personal, something far deeper than typical HOA enforcement. Our confrontation intensified as she pointed toward the truck where my third cow was being forced up the ramp. Neighbors began to gather, some recording with their phones. Perfect. What Martha didn't know was that every insult, every threat, every moment of this public confrontation was being documented. How does a third-generation cattle farmer beat a vengeful HOA president with unlimited resources and county connections? By letting her walk right into a trap that would use her own ambition against her. The earliest memory I have is holding my grandfather's weathered hand as we walked through the barn at dawn. Miller men rise before the sun, he'd say, because the land doesn't work itself. This 75-acre plot has supported our family since 1932, when my grandfather bought it during the Great Depression for $800 and a promise to make it flourish. Through dust storms, economic crashes, and agricultural revolutions, the Miller dairy operation survived, even thrived, where others failed. My father expanded during the 1960s, introducing modern techniques while preserving the methodical care that made our Holsteins some of the finest in the state. I took over in 1998, modernizing further while maintaining our reputation for quality that had customers driving hours for our farm fresh products. The land itself seemed to shape our family character, resilient, patient, and connected to natural rhythms that city folk rarely understand. My sons grew up learning to bottle feed calves before they could tie their own shoes. My daughter could drive a tractor by age 12. We weren't just working the land. We were its stewards, maintaining a legacy across generations. The Oak Ridge Valley remained largely agricultural until 2020, when suburban sprawl finally reached our rural community. Farmland values skyrocketed as developers offered cash deals that elderly farmers couldn't refuse. One by one, century-old operations were sold to development companies promising luxury country living with names like Harvest Meadows and Heritage Point, sanitized references to the agricultural history they were erasing. Last year, Meadow Vista Development Corporation purchased all 520 acres surrounding my property. Within months, bulldozers had cleared century-old oak trees and leveled rolling pastures where cattle had grazed for generations. By Christmas, the first phase of Meadowview Estates opened, 85 homes starting at $750,000, marketed to wealthy professionals and retirees seeking authentic rural atmosphere without rural inconveniences. The trouble began in February with a letter from a newly formed Meadowview Estates Homeowners Association. My agricultural operation was causing community distress through noxious odors and excessive noise, euphemisms for the natural scents and sounds of a working farm that had existed decades before their luxury homes. I ignored the letter. 3 more followed, each more strongly worded than the last. The final notice threatened legal action if I didn't remedy conditions within 30 days, though what exactly needed remedying remained conveniently vague. Then, last Tuesday morning, I was mending fences on my eastern boundary when a black Lincoln Navigator pulled alongside. The woman who emerged wore a crisp pantsuit and designer rain boots that had clearly never seen actual mud. Her carefully highlighted blonde hair and diamond jewelry contrasted sharply with my work-worn appearance. "Mr. Miller," she said, not offering her hand. "I'm Martha Blackwell, president of the Meadowview Estates Homeowners Association. This situation has become untenable." She thrust a manila envelope toward me. "The board has unanimously declared your cattle operation a public nuisance under Section 7 of our community standards. You have 48 hours to remove all livestock from the premises or face legal consequences." I nearly laughed. "Ma'am, my property isn't even part of your HOA. These boundaries were established in 1932, long before people with actual standards moved to Oak Ridge she interrupted, her manicured hand dismissively waving away generations of agricultural history. The county health department and zoning board have both expressed concerns. This isn't just an HOA matter anymore. Something about her tone, the personal satisfaction, caught my attention. I studied her face more carefully, peering past the expensive makeup to the features beneath. "Martha Jenkins?" I asked, suddenly recognizing her. "Harold Jenkins' daughter?" Her expression shifted briefly before settling into a cold smile. "It's Blackwell now. I'm surprised you remember my family, Frank. Most people don't bother remembering the lives they destroy." The memory clicked into place. The Jenkins farm had bordered our eastern acreage until the agricultural recession of 2005. Harold Jenkins, Martha's father, had borrowed heavily from my father to modernize his dairy operation, using his land as collateral. When milk prices collapsed that year, he couldn't make payments. After months of extensions, my father reluctantly foreclosed. Legal proceedings transferred their 80 acres to us. "That was 20 years ago," I said quietly. "And it was business, not personal. Your father received fair market value." "Fair." Her voice hardened as her designer boot crushed a wildflower. "My father never recovered. He lost everything when I was in law school. I had to drop out and watch while your family expanded on land that should have been my inheritance. That land was supposed to fund my education, my future." She gestured toward the sprawling development. "Times change, Miller. My husband chairs the county zoning board now. We've built connections your farming family couldn't imagine." As she turned to leave, she added with chilling calm, "I've waited all my adult life for this moment. By Friday, those cattle will be gone, one way or another. Your father took my future. Now I'll take yours." By Wednesday morning, bright orange notices line my fence. "Livestock removal scheduled. Friday, 10 a.m., Oak Ridge County Health Department." My phone began ringing incessantly. Longtime neighbors expressed outrage at the HOA's overreach. The pastor from Oak Ridge Community Church offered prayers and support. Old classmates promised to show up Friday to stand with me. But there were disturbing calls, too. Harvey Gunderson, county health inspector for 20 years and a friend of my father's, phoned to warn me privately. "Frank, something strange is happening with this complaint." It bypassed normal protocols and went straight to enforcement. "Martha's husband, Robert, has been pressuring department heads. There's talk they're expediting a condemnation order for agricultural contamination. Be careful, this isn't standard procedure." By Wednesday afternoon, the local news had picked up the story. Their website headline read, "Local heritage farm faces modern development pressures, community divided." I drove into town for supplies and witnessed the division firsthand. At Oak Ridge Hardware, old-timers clapped my shoulder and offered encouragement. "Don't let those city slickers push you around, Frank." But at the new coffee shop on Main Street, I overheard newer residents discussing the health hazards and property value impact of my outdated operation. The grocery store became an impromptu debate forum. Mrs. Hendricks, whose family had farmed here since the 1890s, loudly confronted a Meadowview resident. "Your fancy development brochures show pastoral scenes with barns and silos, the very things you're trying to eliminate. You wanted the country view, but not the country's reality." The Meadowview resident, a retired banker from Chicago, responded, "We paid premium prices for homes with certain quality of life expectations. Nobody mentioned we'd be dealing with manure odors and 5 a.m. animal noises." That evening, my neighbor Tom Wilson called. "Frank, you need to see this." He texted photographs from an emergency HOA meeting where Martha had presented in large photos purportedly showing unsanitary conditions on my property. The images showed dilapidated fences, malnourished cattle, and waste-filled water troughs, none of which existed on my meticulously maintained farm. She had distributed a glossy pamphlet titled "Health Risks of Agricultural Operations in Residential Areas," featuring statistics from industrial factory farms, operations nothing like my sustainable, medium-scale dairy. The pamphlet listed alarming claims about groundwater contamination, antibiotic resistance, and parasitic infections supposedly emanating from farms like mine. Most alarmingly, Tom reported Martha had announced the county health department would conduct a comprehensive inspection coinciding with Friday's cattle removal. She promised the findings would provide grounds for permanent agricultural restrictions on my property. This wasn't just an HOA matter anymore. Martha was leveraging government agencies against me, potentially through her husband's influence. Her 20-year grudge had found the perfect vehicle in modern zoning regulations and property codes that increasingly favored development over agriculture. Thursday morning, I called Sheriff Mike Wilson, who'd grown up working summers on his uncle's farm and understood agricultural operations. Over coffee in my kitchen, Mike shared troubling information. Sheriff Mike shared troubling information. "This isn't just about your cows or personal vendettas, Frank," he said, keeping his voice low despite being in my home. "Martha and Robert Blackwell have been involved in every major development in this county since they moved here 5 years ago. Robert has rapidly pushed through zoning changes for 3 developments last year over significant environmental objections. He slid several printed news articles across the table. There are whispers about kickbacks, ignored environmental assessments, and county officials who suddenly retire with unexplained wealth. Nothing proven, but enough smoke to suggest fire." The most recent article detailed how the Blackwells had purchased options on several agricultural properties surrounding new developments, options that increased substantially in value once those properties were rezoned from agricultural to residential. "Now look at this county map," Mike continued, unfolding a large document. "Your property sits right between Meadowview Estates Phase 1 and the proposed Phase 2. If your farm remains agricultural, they need to build access roads around it, decreasing their buildable lots by about 30%. If your land becomes residential, they can connect the developments directly." I finished seeing the strategy clearly. Robert Blackwell's development company would stand to gain millions, Mike confirmed. "The personal grudge might be real, but there's serious money involved too." Mike tapped another document, a printout of county meeting minutes from 3 months ago. The zoning board, chaired by Robert Blackwell, suspended the usual environmental impact assessment requirement for Meadowview Phase 2, citing economic development priorities. That's highly unusual and possibly illegal, especially for development adjacent to active agricultural land. He showed me one last document, a real estate listing showing Martha Blackwell as the agent for several properties neighboring Meadowview Estates. She stands to earn substantial commissions on properties that suddenly became more valuable after her husband's zoning decisions. The conflict of interest is glaring. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked. Mike sighed. "Legally challenging them would take years and cost a fortune. By then, your operation might already be shut down. But," he paused, considering his next words carefully, "there might be other approaches. Sometimes the best defense isn't a direct confrontation, but setting a trap they walk into themselves." As Mike left, he cautioned, "Be careful, Frank. When money and power mix with personal vendettas, people can go to extreme lengths. Document everything. Record every interaction. And remember, Martha's credibility depends on maintaining her image as a community advocate. If that image were damaged." Thursday afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table feeling the weight of 3 generations on my shoulders. Martha had resources, political connections, and a 20-year grudge fueling her determination. Fighting her head-on would be financial suicide, even if I eventually won in court. I needed a different approach, one that used her momentum against her. My first call was to Professor Eleanor Winters at the State Agricultural College. As the leading expert on dairy farming history in our region, she had documented our operation for her research several times. "Your Holstein line is historically significant," she confirmed after hearing my situation. "They're direct descendants of the original Winslow farm importations from Europe in the 1920s, one of the few unbroken bloodlines remaining. That alone might qualify for heritage protection." Eleanor explained that state law provided special protections for agricultural operations with historical significance. The law was specifically designed to prevent valuable agricultural heritage from being erased by development pressure. "Your farm checks every box for protection." Next, I contacted James Franklin, director of the Oak Ridge Agricultural Heritage Museum. James had approached me years earlier about eventually preserving some of our farming implements for the museum, but we never formalized any arrangements. This is precisely why our museum exists, James said emphatically after hearing Martha's plans. To prevent the erasure of our agricultural heritage by development interests. I'll be there tomorrow morning with our preservation specialist. James explained an innovative program the museum had recently launched, a living history initiative where historically significant livestock could be officially owned by the museum but maintained on their original farms, preserving both the animals and their traditional environment. It would require some paperwork, he advised, but we could transfer ownership of your cattle to the museum before tomorrow's confrontation. As museum property, they would have additional legal protections against removal. My final call was to Sarah Livingston, a former classmate who now practiced environmental law in the state capitol. Sarah specialized in cases involving historical preservation and land use rights. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and record every interaction, she advised. What they're attempting has several legal vulnerabilities, especially if the proper environmental and historical assessments weren't conducted before development approval. Sarah explained that developments adjacent to active agricultural operations required special buffer zones and impact studies, requirements that had apparently been waived from Meadowview Estates. If Robert Blackwell used his position to bypass those requirements while his wife was involved in marketing properties that benefited from those decisions, that's a textbook conflict of interest, she noted, the kind that can invalidate approvals and trigger ethics investigations. While making these calls, I noticed an unexpected development on social media. Several Meadowview residents had started a group called Preserve Our Rural Character after learning about Martha's actions. These weren't longtime farmers, but new residents who had specifically moved to the area for its agricultural atmosphere, the very atmosphere Martha claimed was a nuisance. Their post revealed that many Meadowview buyers had been specifically promised authentic farm views and marketing materials that featured photos of my very operation as a selling point. The irony wasn't lost on these residents, who felt misled by Martha's apparent bait-and-switch tactics. By Thursday evening, an unlikely coalition had formed. Agricultural preservation experts, legal advisors, sympathetic new residents, and longtime farming families, all planning to witness Friday's confrontation. The trap was set. Now I just needed Martha to walk into it. Friday morning dawned with dark clouds gathering, both literally and figuratively. By 9:30 a.m., over 50 people had assembled along my fence line. Local news vans parked on the county road, cameras already rolling. Social media had transformed what Martha planned as a routine enforcement action into a community showdown. At precisely 10 a.m., Martha arrived leading a small convoy, 2 county vehicles, a livestock trailer, and several HOA board members in luxury SUVs. She stepped from her navigator wearing a camel-colored pantsuit, her designer boots now protected by clear plastic covers as she surveyed the muddy pasture with distaste. "Quite the audience you've gathered, Miller," she observed coolly, glancing at the crowd. "It won't change anything. We have the proper authorities present." She gestured to a man in a county health department jacket and another with a clipboard bearing the county seal. "Ms. Blackwell," I acknowledged formally. "Before you proceed, I'd like to understand exactly which regulations you believe my operation violates." "We've documented numerous violations," she replied loudly, clearly playing to the cameras. "Excessive noise, noxious odors, potential groundwater contamination, visual blight affecting property values, all clearly outlined in the notices you've received." "Interesting," I replied calmly, "because my operation has passed every agricultural inspection for the past 20 years, including a voluntary environmental audit just last month." I gestured toward Professor Winters, who nodded confirmation. Martha's smile tightened. "Those standards aren't relevant to residential communities. Our homeowners have rights to peaceful enjoyment of their properties without agricultural disturbances." A voice called from the crowd, one of the Meadowview residents I'd never met before. "We bought here because of the farms. Your brochures showed this exact property as a selling point. Martha ignored this, signaling impatiently to the transport worker. Enough delays. Begin loading the cattle immediately. As the workers entered the pasture, my Holsteins, sensing unfamiliar presence, moved nervously toward the barn. The workers herded them toward the trailer using plastic pipes as prods. The gentle animals, and used to harsh handling, bellowed in confusion. Careful with those animals, I warned as one worker roughly pushed a reluctant heifer. They're registered breeding stock. They're public nuisances being removed. Martha corrected with satisfaction, loud enough for everyone to hear. The board has unanimously determined they violate Section 7 of our community standards. The crowd murmured as the first cows reluctantly climbed the ramp into the trailer. Several Meadowview residents looked uncomfortable witnessing the actual process their HOA had initiated. "You're making a serious mistake," I stated calmly. Martha smiled for the news cameras. "The mistake was thinking you could maintain this outdated operation while our community modernizes around you." "This isn't about modernization," I replied, projecting my voice so everyone could hear. "This is about a 20-year vendetta because your father couldn't pay his debts. And perhaps about how much your husband's development company stands to gain if my property is rezoned." Gasps and whispers rippled through the onlookers. Martha's face flushed deeply. "That's preposterous and defamatory," she hissed. "This is about property values and community standards." "Is it?" I asked, gesturing toward the crowd. "Because many of your own residents moved here specifically because of the authentic rural character my farm provides. The character your marketing materials prominently feature." I held up a Meadowview Estates brochure that prominently displayed my red barn and grazing Holsteins on its cover, the very animals now being loaded onto trucks. Several Meadowview residents nodded in agreement, some even applauding. One elderly woman called out, "We paid extra for the pastoral view lots that looked directly over this farm." Martha maintained her composure, though her knuckles whitened around the clipboard she held. Temporary views during development are not guaranteed amenities. Our community plan always included modernization of adjacent properties. As the final cow entered the trailer, Martha turned triumphantly toward the cameras. "This demonstrates our commitment to maintaining Meadowview Estates as the county's premier residential community. The removal of these agricultural nuisances will enhance property values and quality of life for all residents." "Before you leave," I said loudly, approaching the county official with a leather portfolio, "you need to review these documents immediately." The official, who I recognized as Robert Blackwell's assistant from zoning board meetings, reluctantly accepted the folder. His expression transformed as he flipped through the papers, confusion giving way to concern. "Ms. Blackwell," he said hesitantly, "there appears to be an irregularity here. According to these registration documents, these cattle aren't actually owned by Mr. Miller." Martha snatched the papers from his hands, her French manicure a stark contrast against the official documents. "What are you talking about? Of course they're his cattle." "Actually," I explained as James Franklin from the Agricultural Heritage Museum stepped forward. "As of Wednesday afternoon, these cattle are officially owned by the Oak Ridge Agricultural Heritage Museum as living exhibits of historic agricultural practices. They're here under a formal museum loan program." James nodded, addressing the assembled crowd and news cameras. "The Miller-Holstein bloodline represents one of the oldest continuous dairy lineages in the state, a living connection to our agricultural heritage. The museum has recognized their historical significance by incorporating them into our living history program." He gestured toward the cattle in the trailer. "These animals aren't simply livestock. They're living artifacts of our regional agricultural development. Some descend directly from the first Holstein importations of the 1920s, with genetics no longer found in commercial operations." The county official looked increasingly uncomfortable. "The museum is a protected cultural institution under County Statute 47B. Removing these animals would constitute interference with an official county educational program." Martha's triumphant expression cracked slightly. This is obviously a last-minute maneuver to circumvent legitimate enforcement actions. The timing alone proves the transfer paperwork was filed and approved 3 days ago. James interrupted, handing copies to the news reporters. All proper protocols were followed. He turned to the crowd. The museum has been documenting the Miller operation for years. This partnership formalizes our long-standing recognition of its historical significance. One of the HOA board members, an older gentleman who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "Martha, you didn't mention anything about the cattle being part of a museum program. You said this was a straightforward nuisance abatement." "Because it's clearly a sham arrangement," Martha insisted, recovering quickly. "Regardless of who technically owns these animals, they remain a nuisance under our community standards. The removal will proceed." "I'm afraid that's not possible," I replied, pulling out another document bearing the official seal of the State Historical Commission. "You see, this property itself has a special status you seem unaware of." The county official examined the new document, his face paling visibly. "Is this what I think it is?" I nodded. This property was designated as an agricultural heritage site 4 months ago under the State Farm Preservation Act. That designation exempts it from all local zoning regulations and nuisance claims under state law protecting historic agricultural operations. A murmur of interest spread through the crowd as news cameras zoomed in on the document. "That's impossible," Martha objected. "Such designations require extensive review and public comment periods. There was no notification of any application." "Actually," Professor Winters interjected, stepping forward with her own folder. "The application was submitted 8 months ago, with all required public notices published in the county record as required by law. The State Historical Commission conducted their site assessment in January and granted approval in February." She handed copies of the public notices to the reporters. "These notices appeared in the legal section of the county record for 6 consecutive weeks, as required by statute. All adjacent property owners were also notified by certified mail." The county health inspector looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, if this property has heritage site designation, we don't have jurisdiction to remove livestock or enforce nuisance complaints against historical agricultural practices. The designation is specifically meant to protect operations like the Miller Farm from encroachment by incompatible development," Professor Winters explained to the crowd. "The law recognizes that our agricultural heritage must be preserved, even as communities grow." Martha turned to her husband's assistant, anger breaking through her carefully maintained facade. "This can't be right. Robert would have informed me of any heritage applications affecting Meadowview." This opened the perfect opportunity for my third revelation. "That's the most interesting part," I said, addressing not Martha, but the news cameras and assembled residents. "I personally delivered notification of this heritage application and subsequent approval to both the HOA and the County Zoning Board, chaired by Ms. Blackwell's husband, 6 months ago. From my portfolio, I produced a final document, a certified mail receipt with Robert Blackwell's signature, dated February 15th. The Zoning Board acknowledged receipt of this notification," I continued. "Yet they proceeded to approve Phase 2 of Meadowview Estates without conducting the mandatory environmental and heritage impact assessments required by state law for development adjacent to designated agricultural heritage sites." The assembled crowd fell silent as implications sank in. One of the board members stepped forward, a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s. "Martha, you repeatedly assured us all proper permits were in order. You specifically said there were no complications with adjacent properties when we raised concerns about buffer zones." Another board member added, "You told us the farmer was operating illegally and county officials supported enforcement action. You never mentioned any heritage designation." Martha's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling in real time, captured by news cameras and dozens of smartphone videos. "These technicalities don't change the fundamental issues," she insisted, though her voice had lost its authoritative edge. "The proximity of agricultural operations still affects our property values." The board voted unanimously, based on the information you provided, interrupted the female board member. Information that now appears incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. Rain began to fall lightly, adding dramatic effect to the moment as clouds darkened overhead. The county official cleared his throat nervously. Given these documents, I have no choice but to suspend this enforcement action pending further review. The cattle will need to be unloaded. Martha turned to him in disbelief. You can't be serious. We have authorized removal orders. Based on potential jurisdiction we apparently don't have, he replied, already backing toward his vehicle. I'm not risking my department's liability by removing protected historical assets from a designated heritage site. The transport worker looked to Martha for direction, clearly confused by the unfolding situation. This isn't over, Miller, Martha hissed, her composure cracking. Robert will have something to say about this heritage designation. I'm sure he will, I agreed calmly. Particularly since approving residential development without conducting mandatory impact assessments for adjacent heritage sites violates state environmental protection statutes. Statutes with significant penalties, both for the county and for individual officials who neglect their due diligence. As if on cue, Sarah Livingston stepped forward, introducing herself to the news reporters as an environmental law specialist. My firm has been monitoring several questionable development approvals in Oak Ridge County, she explained professionally. The Meadowview Estates project raised red flags when it received expedited approval without standard environmental impact studies. Learning today that it also proceeded without heritage impact assessment adds significant legal concerns. She turned to address the assembled HOA members directly. Homeowners should be aware that developments approved without proper environmental and heritage assessments can face retroactive permitting issues, potentially affecting property titles and insurance. This statement caused immediate consternation among the Meadowview residents. One called out, "Are you saying our home purchases could be compromised by improper approvals?" It's certainly a concern worth investigating, Sarah confirmed, particularly given the apparent conflict of interest with the zoning board chair's wife leading enforcement actions against the very heritage site that should have triggered additional assessment requirements. She pulled out a folder of her own. We've been compiling documentation showing a pattern of expedited approvals for projects connected to Blackwell Development Group, projects where normal environmental protections were waived. Today's event suggests that practice may have extended to heritage site regulations as well. A news reporter approached Martha with an extended microphone. Ms. Blackwell, residents are suggesting your husband's position on the zoning board may have influenced development approvals that benefited you financially. Public records show your company purchased options on parcels adjacent to Mr. Miller's farm, options that would increase substantially in value if his property were rezoned from agricultural to residential. Would you care to comment? Another reporter added, is it true that marketing materials for Meadowview Estates featured Mr. Miller's farm as an amenity, even as you were working to have it removed? A third called out, can you explain why the HOA pursued enforcement action against a legally protected heritage site without informing board members of its status? Martha retreated toward her navigator without answering, her carefully cultivated image as a community advocate shattered by the revelation of her personal vendetta and potential financial corruption. As she drove away, several HOA board members remained behind, clearly distancing themselves from her actions. Many of us had no idea about the heritage designation or the potential conflicts of interest, admitted the female board member who had challenged Martha earlier. We were simply told this was a standard nuisance abatement supported by county officials. The cattle were unloaded from the trailer, returning to their familiar pasture as rain fell steadily. The peaceful animals seemed oblivious to the human drama they had unwittingly sparked, a drama that would reshape our community's relationship with its agricultural heritage. The confrontation became the catalyst for unexpected change throughout the community. County commissioners launched an investigation into the zoning board's practices after multiple news outlets picked up the story. Robert Blackwell resigned his position within 2 weeks, citing personal reasons as allegations mounted that he had approved multiple developments without required environmental and historical impact assessments. The investigation expanded to examine all Meadowview Estates approvals and permits. Inspectors discovered critical buffer zones between agricultural operations and residential areas had been eliminated from final plans despite appearing in submitted documents. Stormwater management systems required for protecting agricultural watershed areas had been designated optional future improvements. These revelations triggered a top-to-bottom review of county development procedures. 3 additional zoning officials resigned as the investigation widened to include other developments connected to Blackwell projects. The story resonated far beyond our local community, touching on wider concerns about development, agricultural preservation, and the abuse of HOA powers. National media picked up the David versus Goliath narrative, bringing attention to the importance of protecting agricultural heritage in rapidly developing areas. Within a month, the Meadowview Estates HOA held emergency elections. Martha was removed unanimously, replaced by Eleanor Winters, the retired history professor who had recently moved to Meadowview specifically for its rural character. Under her leadership, the HOA approached me with a revolutionary proposal. "We want to partner with your farm, not fight it," Eleanor explained at my kitchen table, surrounded by a committee of both long-standing residents and new homeowners. "Your operation could become the centerpiece of our community's identity, not something to hide or remove." Their vision included seasonal farm-to-table events using my products, educational programs for local schools, and even community garden plots where residents could learn agricultural basics under my guidance. "Most of us moved here seeking authentic connection to rural traditions," Eleanor explained. "We just needed someone to show us how to honor those traditions meaningfully rather than treating them as obstacles to property values." Meanwhile, the State Agricultural College offered grant funding to establish a small agricultural museum in my historic barn, celebrating 3 generations of sustainable farming practices. The very cattle Martha had tried to remove would remain as living exhibits of our region's agricultural heritage. The county adopted new zoning regulations requiring meaningful buffer zones between agricultural operations and residential developments, along with more stringent notification requirements for heritage sites. Several neighboring farms applied for heritage status, creating a protected agricultural corridor that would preserve our region's farming legacy for generations. Sometimes what appears to be the end of a tradition becomes its new beginning. Today, my grandfather's farm doesn't just survive, it thrives as the heart of a community that has rediscovered its agricultural roots. The quarterly Miller Heritage Farm Days have become a regional attraction, drawing visitors from across the state. Children who have never seen a cow up close now learn to milk one under my guidance. Urban transplants discover the satisfaction of growing their own food in community garden plots established on a corner of my property. The Meadowview Estates marketing materials now proudly feature their unique connection to a working heritage farm, a genuine distinction in an era of cookie-cutter developments. Property values have actually increased since the Heritage Partnership began, with homes adjacent to the farm commanding premium prices for their authentic rural vistas. A portion of HOA dues now supports the Heritage Preservation Fund, ensuring that the agricultural character that drew residents here remains protected. The model has been so successful that 3 neighboring counties have adopted similar approaches, creating a network of preserved heritage farms throughout the region. As for Martha and Robert Blackwell, they quietly sold their Meadowview estate after the ethics investigation revealed they had manipulated regulations for personal gain in multiple developments. The 20-year grudge that consumed Martha ultimately cost her far more than she ever stood to gain. The fence that once marked the boundary between my property and Meadowview Estates now features decorative gates that open regularly for community events. The eldest Holstein cow from my grandfather's original bloodline, Old Bessie, has become something of a local celebrity, appearing on the cover of the Meadowview community newsletter. When powerful interests try to erase your heritage, sometimes the smartest defense isn't confrontation, but preparation. Martha thought she was confiscating my cattle, but she walked right into the trap of her own making, revealing the very corruption and conflicts of interest that had allowed her to accumulate power in the first place. In standing my ground, I not only preserved my family's legacy, but helped forge a new community model where agricultural tradition and modern residential life enhance rather than threaten each other. The land my grandfather purchased in 1932 continues its purpose, not as a relic of the past, but as a living bridge to a more balanced future, one where we honor the roots that sustain us, even as we grow in new directions. Martha's attempt to confiscate my cows didn't just fail, it transformed our community's relationship with its agricultural heritage. Sometimes your opponents do your work for you, especially when they're so blinded by old grudges that they can't see the trap until they've walked right into it.